doing more than just hanging out with my friends. So, if anybody's there, please make a comment. Let me know that this is sort of working. All right, and now I'm recording. So, as I was saying before, this is the first time I've used Twitch as a forum for communication. Before the pandemic, I had a history of giving lectures and talks. And back when I was maybe in my 20s and early 30s, I started giving regular permaculture lectures as part of different permaculture design courses in the region. And later on, when I was working on some of the synthesis I was doing for thinking about how we can transform urban design so that it contributes to soil building and ultimately changes the balance of deposition to erosion so that we can actually do something about climate change. I was giving a series of talks at the time, and then we got hit really hard with the pandemic, and Twitter became my main space for teaching. And it only goes so far. It's only so effective. So I've been aware for a while. I'm just getting this is obviously my getting ready for Twitch. I got my environment. I got my light set up. In a week, I'm wanting to get back into the swing of things and be giving regular talks on permaculture, ecological design, and how collectively we can work together on a future that works for everybody. In the meantime, I think it would just be fun because the way I got good at Twitter was I started tweeting. And I made a lot of mistakes, and I just tried things out. And I've noticed that whenever you have a new person show up on Twitter and try to use it, you can kind of tell what online spaces they've been in the past. You can always sort of tell if somebody's used to more advertising or if they're like Facebook culture and they land in Twitter and suddenly they're just sort of like proclaiming things to a general audience rather than developing any kind of intimacy. And I think it takes a while for people to feel comfortable in a particular online space. So it's pretty likely that I'll be bringing Twitter aesthetics and culture into this space as I try to use it and also try to draw on my own past. Now, if anybody's hearing this, please chat in the chat so that I can know that it's actually going out. Otherwise, maybe this is going off into nothingness. I see there's 5 viewers. All right. Well, I think I want to start with kind of the communications that I was starting to do back on Twitter and make sure that we're doing something similar here. So I just learned how to use this space. I'm such like an old man right now. I'm trying to figure this out. But here, if I go into this one, I can pull up my Twitter. And I want to go into my main account. And pull up our threads. So one of the reasons why I switched to doing this is that I am hoping right now that we can start being more useful to people. I want to be useful. And one of the things I'm doing right now is I have a pledge drive. We're trying to raise $3,000 to cover our expenses. And people have asked me what those expenses are. Well, it's pretty simple. We're trying to grow something a little larger than just somebody with a backyard. So we rent a space that we use for our office. And in the backyard of that space, we are growing chestnut trees in dense orchards. Planting currently, this last year we planted 10,000 trees. Or no, sorry, 2 years ago we planted 10,000 trees. And we planted actually 12,000 and we had success of about 10,000, which is really good for nurseries. We did that by having a couple of work parties where we planted out, raised beds, just only maybe 4 inches high and only 4 feet wide. And just put those out on top of the soil. Did not even dig into the soil. Just put a layer of cardboard on top of the grass. And then we set the chestnuts in the top there. And took care of them as they sprouted. Now, the first thing that we had to deal with was we had stored the chestnuts in buckets over winter. And normally, storing them in wet compost or coconut coir or sand is the ideal way of storing them. But because of climate change, we now in Oregon have been getting this hot spell in January. And that led to the trees taking root and sprouting earlier than we had thought. So it was a scramble to get those trees pulled out of the buckets, untangle the roots, and then gently get them into the ground. And then the next wave was that we had squirrels. So dealing with the squirrels was complicated. We ended up building temporary greenhouses with greenhouse plastic and metal poles over the beds. And that seems to have taken care of them. We were able to let much more survivorship. So now the trees have been handed out. We've handed out 8,000 of them so far. And most of those have gone to Pacific Northwest and Native community. And the rest of them have gone out through organizations. The original plan was people gathering together and finding new places in their yards and in their neighbors and developing that culture. And that's still the vision, and that's still what's happening over time. But with the pandemic, it's a little harder to do face-to-face organizing. And so we've been drawing on community groups and organizations, groups involved in social justice, folks involved in the active part of the spiritual community. So we've had a lot of success working with progressive and humanitarian churches, synagogues, that kind of thing. And also working with schools, because kids love planting trees, and then you have a food source in the fall that's useful for them. So that's been a great success. I'm not seeing any proof that anybody's actually on here other than myself. So I just want to make sure that we're actually getting people. Oh, there we go. Hi there. Hi, Deadward. Thank you. I just wanted proof that it actually was like connecting with the system. So our trees they need a place. We have a place for them. Looks good. Good. Is it in focus? This is basically my mic check for next week, is what I'm imagining. Awesome. That's good to hear. The sound's okay? I'm not like overloading you or anything with it? I've been really impressed sitting on friends' Twitch streams and realizing that this is such a great space because, yeah, this time I'm going to talk a bunch, but I could bring in guest speakers. I can show different things. So we're going to start viewing this as a classroom and meeting space for at least the kinds of things where we want presentations. And then more organizing can happen. We have a Discord, and I'll make sure that I have things next week that are posting how to get onto these things. But you can go onto our website, buildsoil.net, starting 2 days from now when I get that launched. We're ready, almost. And in the meantime, our Twitter handle, @buildsoil, lets people access all of our tweets, but at the top we have access of how to find a Discord and how to find other things like that. So the fundraiser is to cover some of the grounds for that, and also we're trying to make sure that there's a couple positions of people that can work on this thing, because our visions include moving beyond just planting, a few trees in a few cities. We're already trying to build networking tools that allow for people to come together and start working on projects elsewhere. And we're already beginning on a couple projects that are waiting for some grants, where we're going to be doing demonstrations of soil building, as well as large-scale interventions with landscape to help with water infiltration, ponds, swales, those kinds of things, in order to help speed up soil building processes. And that should be really fun and exciting, because it can be creative and it can be exciting. And we can redesign our world so that it actually, has net benefit. And we tend to go for these high-tech solutions because we can't imagine actually changing the fundamentals. But to me, that's a little bit like, I have a friend who's an architect, and he helps people rebuild their buildings, their homes. And they look through their building, and they can't imagine ever taking down that wall that divides those two rooms, because they have no sense that, like, what's permanent and what's impermanent, what's holding up the roof and what's not. And the truth is, a lot of things in a house you can blast through. So the same thing is true for the earth. People get really thinking that they have to put icing on the cake, when sometimes we can just change the shape of the cake. And a lot of good comes from thinking back on the fundamentals of primary productivity, photosynthesis, sunlight, clean water at elevation moved by sunlight, biological fecundity, the support of ecosystems. So sometimes getting those things right allows for technological solutions to emerge over time as necessary, rather than trying to rely on them as the fundamental push. So it's better to have a good garden first and then build your website about it, right? It's better to make sure that you're storing as much sunlight as you can in biology and in clean water before you start adding on solar panels and the technological parts of it, because otherwise you're building a tower with no foundation. And so we can do both. And if you're going to do one, you better do the other. If you want the top of a pyramid, you have to build the bottom of the pyramid. So that's the work that we're trying to do in here. So rather than making people look at, I want to look right now. You have 7 viewers. I'm really grateful people are here. Now, as I said before, this is the awkward version of this as I learn how to use Twitch. But I wanted to start. So I believe that we've set it up so that there's a donation button available on this stream. But it took me all day to try to set things up, and I think it may not have connected correctly. Please consider joining our Patreon, patreon.com/buildsoil. And that allows us to have a regular funding source that we can keep going with. And I'm really sorry that I have to keep fundraising. We're like a little below our regular overhead budget. And so if we can dial things up to the next level, then we're excited and we get to work on what we're doing. But here's what I want to start with. So here in Build Soil at the top, we have our pinned tweet. And our pinned tweet, like I said, describes donations. But we have here the master thread list. And I want to go through a couple of them. I think the first one I want to go through is a little bit of a biography, because I put out to people questions like, what exactly do you want to learn about? Let's see if I can find this. What exactly do you want to learn about? And people said the same thing, which is that they wanted to first know a little bit about me because they've been following the account for so long. Here we go. We've been following the account for so long that they were like, who is this person? And obviously moving into Twitch, I have a face. Well, before I could hide behind a gigantic icon of a chestnut. So I figure a nice way to start and practice and get used to being comfortable, because I'm a little uncomfortable speaking to people like this. The best way to do that is to actually go through something. And luckily, over the last few years, I have been building this like 400-page Twitter library of ideas. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's the link. Thank you very much, Edward. I'm hoping next week to have a little bit more standards around my moderation, also in case random bots show up and stuff like that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my background, and I think I have a lot of different streams that kind of brought me into the work that I'm trying to do right now. But one of the things that I think is really essential is that as a young person, I saw many examples of activist communities that were built on multi-generational collaborative work. And one of the benefits of that is that I saw a community form where it was never a culture of personality. There were personalities, there were people who like we knew and who were involved in things. But in terms of like celebrities, there were no celebrity activists. There were no people who were cooler than everybody else. And that's empowering, because it makes you realize that you can act in a way where you don't have to be the hero. And I try to enter into spaces where clearly I'm not the hero of the story. Like, clearly I'm just there to help make a few links. I'm more of a technician in that I understand how some ideas work, or I can provide a space. But I have always approached Build Soil with the concept that the actual people who are going to do the work that adds up to transforming this world are the people around me and the people in community with me. And so every day I try to wake up and serve the community of people that are like interested in engaging and transforming the world. So for me, that's the space that we can all occupy, which is that, you see a lot of marketing culture built into activism these days, where people are using the tools of marketing to try to like separate themselves. I use Build Soil. I use this idea. But the truth is that it's just a set of words and it's an organization so that we can channel some funds. And the real purpose is giving chestnuts to people and teaching people to do that so they can go do it on themselves. And I would say that there's two successes that I want to have for our project. And one is I want soil to be built. Like, I want to see 100 parts per million of the Earth's atmosphere transformed back into ecological storages. And at the same time, I would really prefer that, like, nobody remembers that there was this project. I would like to be replaced, and I would like this project to eventually become so normalized that it doesn't matter because we are all doing this work. So, primary values that I want to have in this. But let me tell you a little bit about the culture of that fermented me, that made me sort of grow up. So here we go. When I was 16, I'll just read these and then I'll talk about it. When I grew up in Portland, Oregon, when I was 16, I was already interested in permaculture, and I heard this radio recording. I just read the book Ecotopia, which is a problematic book, but still kind of inspiring. Yeah, hey there. Welcome. I'm basically just like practicing this space so that I can do a better job in the future. But I'm going to tell my life story a little bit. So I'm going to use one of the Twitter threads for it. So I grew up in a culture that already had a lot of permaculture going on and a lot of activism going on. And there was a great community radio station where, every day you could turn on the radio and hear somebody in your community talking. And I had just read the book Ecotopia, and I turned on the radio, and there were these people talking about a new project that had just happened really down the road from me. And I got on a bus and I rode down to see what was going on. And well, this is what I saw. In the middle of the street. Neighbors had taken over the street and painted it illegally. And they had been, before my time, they had been coming together, and they had built this meeting house on the corner. This is before my time. This is when I showed up. They built a meeting house on the corner, and they started having gatherings together. I wonder if I showed a picture of it here. Well, not yet. So they had started having gatherings together in this like meeting house. And every Monday night, people from all over the neighborhood would show up with potlucks, and they would hang candles from the dormers and doors and keep adding to this thing, adding gardens, adding patios. And people were showing up from all over the world. It had become this center for people traveling. The late 90s were a really interesting time of a lot of global alliances forming. The Zapatistas had just reached out a few years after their initial emergence to the world, and they started reaching out to activist communities. And so there was this trail of people traveling all over the world and ending up in Chiapas and then traveling again and spreading communiques and words of what had been happening. And that led for this really interesting mixing of ideas and tactics and approaches, and people who you would think of as maybe more liberal and people who were definitely like far on the radical side, bumping shoulders, finding new ways of doing things, being artistic and creative, but not in a way that was isolating. It was pretty impressive. So this thing happened and people were going to it, and then the city said, you can't do this. You can't have an illegal structure made out of like old doors, and you can't have hundreds and hundreds of people. Like on the biggest nights, there were like 2,000 people showing up and making tea and having music and taking over the street. So it got taken down, which is, terrible. This thing that had become like a regular, every week the neighbors would come together and have a meeting about the neighborhood, about what they wanted, about what they were starting to have this democratic institution emerging just because they created a place. And they were like, we have to have a place for this. Like, it didn't work in somebody's home. It had to be somewhere. So they did this. They had a street party. They had a street party, right? And so they took over the street, and then they painted this thing. They painted this giant mandala, and they set up the corners of the street with structures. There was a stage, and there was a community produce exchange space, and there was a temporary meeting house, and kids built a structure for themselves to play in. And there was this 24-hour hot water tea station. I'll do a slideshow at some point with more pictures, but it's fun that I just already made this Twitter thread about it. So, again, the city said, you can't do that. But the way Portland was working in the 90s was it was sort of an unknown city. Like developers hadn't discovered us yet. And in the 70s, there had been this movement of former like anti-war activists who got into politics, like regular politics. And so we were starting to do all these interesting things. And there was usually somebody in City Hall that you could be like, let's talk about green roofs, or like, let's talk about changing policy to fit this like book of theory that was about ecological design. There's always somebody who was like, okay, we'll talk to the mayor, we'll figure this out. And so in this case, we showed up at a city council meeting with a litany of city goals and showed how they were tied to this project. This project mitigated traffic accidents because it actually slowed traffic as people moved from one surface to the other. It allowed for more community participation. It was giving space for kids to do things. And it was also doing kind of like a, I hate the term, but eyes on the street. Well, I guess it's Jane Jacobs, right? Like the Jane Jacobs eyes on the street thing. And it was making people directly involved. And the city was like, okay, temporary permit. We'll give you a temporary permit for this. And this is about the time I was showing up. So let's see what I got here in the pictures. Oh, yeah. So this is me back then. I don't know if it's a good picture. This is me as a teenager at like 17. And moving big objects. And oh, here we go. Here's exactly what it looked like the day I showed up. It's kind of hippie, but it's more, we like to say vernacular aesthetics, because it's the aesthetics that emerge when people are making things with their own hands together. It blew my mind. It changed my life, this moment. So here's some of the stuff that was on the corners. Reading space for the kids. Now you see these tiny libraries. Man, these were the first of those. This is 1997. Neighbors would come out and have breakfast together. People that never talked to each other before were having breakfast together. Non-commercial spaces. Everybody chipping in. The spaces between their homes becoming the piazza, the plaza, right? These things absent in Western culture. Or sorry, absent in Western United States culture. Like the Western part of the United States. Here's kids after a workshop. Building their own tables and benches. So, yeah, here we go. Here's the neighbors repaint it every year. So here they're painting it like with a fake brick pattern. And here's a wedding in the piazza where the intersections of the streets meet each other. Oh, we got 18 viewers. Thanks for being here, folks. So we needed to find a way to get City of Portland people excited enough to turn this temporary thing into an ongoing urban process, to actually like legitimize the idea that we could transform public space in this way. So what we did is we built a mobile public space. If you have any questions or anything, please feel free to drop them in the chat too. Again, this is my first time doing this, so pardon any like technical errors or like problems with it. So we built this thing. So this is a truck with a cafe built on the back, and images of sacred and community spaces of the world decoupaged all over the surface of the truck. And this structure is a scaffolding system, right? Oh, awesome. Thank you. And we tie these wings, these plastic bamboo wings on, and set up these spaces that people could sit under. Every Monday night, we would go to a different park in Portland and have these events. And it started to get a following. I remember at the peak of it, we were having like 500 to 700 people showing up, ready to help. And so it has these structures that come off the truck. The funny thing about these things is like this would not look as cool now because the food carts are so normal. But at the time, a thing would just show up in a park. And I got to say, this thing is hard to set up. And that was on purpose. These scaffolds have to get hauled off of the truck and then put back on and tied on and bolted on and lifted up. And this was by design, because we would show up and there would be a ton of people just like gawking at us. And immediately we were wearing plain clothes. We were not trying to be cool or special. We would just like spread out into the crowd and get everybody to help. Okay, can you stand there? All right, we need your help with this. Can you hold that? All right, 1, 2, 3, lift, right? Getting everybody into the flow. And by the end of it, if somebody showed up and was like, who did this? Who did this? I mean, who knows? It could be you, right? And that means that people then started showing up the next week too, and the next week, and the next week, and it got bigger and weirder and more fun and more creative. And that's important, that things that we do empower people directly, not just by like ideology or language. Like we need to give people moments of deciding to participate. So let's see. Yeah, here we go. Here's people setting it up. So we're driving in a different park, and you'd show up in the park and you'd see this. Who are these people? What's going on here? What is this thing? And here we go. All right, are you gonna help set it up? All right, here we go. 1, 2, 3. And then of course we need somewhere to sit, so we drive a van full of pillows and put it exactly on the opposite side of the park, and have a pillow brigade. Everybody throwing the pillow together and getting them on rugs put underneath, and then we'd have a huge like music and party and conversation. Circle up, get to know each other. We're this truck. We're the tea horse. And this is for you. Have fun. And then we drive away the next day, right? Not be there. And serving tea. So that absence, that sense of absence was really essential, because the next day people would say like, yeah, wow, my park is just a park. Why don't I use it that way? Why isn't this normal? We'd make chai tea, serve it. And pretty soon, anybody who showed up, within a week or two, they were already in the truck serving tea, or like making the tea, or like adding something to the project. It's pretty great. Good. I actually have some pictures of the original project that inspired the whole thing. So this was the meeting house on the corners of the streets, called the Tea House. And this was before my time. I didn't get to go here. But these are pallets, just old pallets that have been like filled in so that they're safer. And a building has been built out of sticks and windows and pallets. And this is what the city eventually had to take down. But how beautiful is something just so simple, made from such simple materials for the purposes of community? Every place a place. We built a lot of things like this in the following years. Wouldn't it be nice if this was in your neighborhood? I wish there was something like this currently in mine. And the purpose of this, right, is here we go. So this is, I guess I'm not even reading my own writing in here. So here's what we did. We actually made so much of a buzz with this project that the city ended up enacting an ordinance. So there is a city ordinance in the city of Portland. And this ordinance has actually spread to a number of other cities. I don't know the current list. The nonprofit that we ended up forming when I was back involved, City Repair, still exists, and they still are involved in facilitating those kinds of processes. And there's other people that do similar things. But the city ordinance said this: if you can get 80% agreement within a 2-block radius of a location that does not already have a transportation corridor issue, you can make public changes to the right-of-way. So, democracy. If you can get enough people on the same page, you can transform public space. As long as it's not supposed to be a bus, or it's like a commercial street that's already like crammed full of people. So that we formed a nonprofit, and we just started talking to neighbors and saying, would you like to talk to each other? And we ended up finding a process of like 9 months of meetings of people getting together and like saying, all right, what's our problems? What do we want? And they would begin to design together. And when they were done with that design process, they had reached that 80% or more approval of people. Then they would apply for a permit. And we started having events called the Village Building Convergence that actually were the spaces where we would do 20 to 50 construction projects simultaneously over a 10-day period with speakers and music in the evenings. So here's some neighbors doing a design charrette, which is a term in architecture for like a design process that's collaborative. Oh, here's me back in 2004. Kind of skinny. So this was the people gathering for the evening gathering. Oh, we got 24 viewers now. Hey, if anybody wants to put any comments or questions, I'm here and I can totally adapt this presentation to answer them. And also, this is an attempt at a fundraiser. So please consider donating or joining our Patreon, patreon.com/buildsoil. And there's a donation actually that's currently in the chat of our Streamlabs donation page. So, oh, thank you. We're trying to raise money to keep the project going. So, oh, this is just people working in their yards, destroying the concrete, de-paving. This was a project where day laborers were the only people who were there in the space regularly, and the local stores. And so when the local community of like landowners asked us to be involved, we're like, well, wait a minute, this site has people who are involved in this location who you're not inviting to the table. So we insisted, and the space became a space for salsa. Which is amazing. And other kinds of dance and music. So, City Repair Project, which I really recommend that you check out that nonprofit, and lots of videos on YouTube. And their work has expanded in ways that go off in other directions from what we were doing back then, but are also involved in involved in a lot of social justice and involved in a lot of indigenous solidarity and support, and actually like working as people of color. But our vision was that back then was that we were going to have a public square of merit in every neighborhood in the city of Portland before we were done. So we like transformed backyards. This is a backyard, and they took out the fences between several neighbors and turned their backyard into a meeting space for neighborhood meetings and classes. And this is a workshop being done on, I think this was a natural building construction workshop that was being done in the backyard of a space that has gates of opening to neighbors. And we started putting out these sort of like aspirational maps. We're going to have at least one piazza in every neighborhood in the city. And I believe now that they have like maybe over 100 projects that they've done, probably way more than that. When I left the project in 2007, we had already done over 70 projects. So there must be like hundreds now. So great. And we started having larger events. And let's see. So pretty soon we started getting involved in more permanent stuff. And we ended up developing a really nice relationship with the head of green building in the city of Portland. And he had all of these visions of what he wanted to see in Portland. He wanted to see earth and construction. He had like translated the German earth and construction code to English and was like really trying to push to get the city to start moving to rammed earth and cob and those kinds of things, pointing out that there had already been all of this research done on like load and like structure and grading for it. So like we didn't really even have to do any experiments. And he was also really interested in green roofs and those kinds of things. So he just was like, do projects and I will grandfather them in. Do something and I will make sure that once we use you as the case study, you get approved in hindsight. So we started building physical structures and working with neighbors for that. So here's the corner of a street where now neighbors sit under an awning of a structure that they built and designed together with an earthen oven. And they can come and cook or heat or bake bread together and do that regularly. And it's there for the offering of the local community. And we built all of these kiosks. Now, green roofs are actually pretty normal in Portland and Chicago and other cities now. This was maybe one of the first 2 green roofs in the city of Portland. And we got funded by the city just to install this little green roof, a tiny solar panel, and a cob structure. And we designed this structure to prove to people that cob construction could be as legitimate as other kinds of construction. So this has a full foundation like you would build a house. And it's built with how you would build a section of a wall of a house. So that we could take people there and be like, oh yeah, you could drive a semi truck into this. And yeah. Yeah, cob baby. This is what started it all. This is why everybody started building cob. Now, I got to have some comments that cob also requires the continuation of community. So you can't just plop a cob thing and expect that it's going to be like sound in 10 years. It's really essential that you are building community at the same time that you're building physical structures, because every culture that actually uses cob, whether it's Wales, yeah, cob begets cob. And we used to call it the cob community, right? And call each other cobrads. The cultures that use earthen materials, they do it regularly. So Wales, American Southwest, like all these spaces, Adobe, those kinds of structures, you got to have like every couple of years, you have to go out there and like maintain the thing, put up plaster, that kind of thing. So culture is like essential. Now that's not like bad. That's like that culture does other things because of that, because they can build together, they can cook together, they can support each other, they can deal with accidents or emergencies or forest fires or, all the things that happen because you actually have like experiences with each other. The question is, do you just have to recob cracks and stuff like that? What you really need to do is make sure that you're keeping direct water off of cob. Like Wales is a pretty wet spot, but they always do really low roof overhangs, and you'll need to have a foundation that keeps the cob out of moisture. You do want to like be aware of cracking. And one of the ways you do that is you basically have like the main cob, you have a plaster layer, and you've got a series of plaster layers until you have the fine plasters. And so every few years you actually need to kind of like be aware of if the plaster is cracking and then see if cracking plaster has led to deeper cracks. But those can be repaired. Usually it's just a matter of like making more cob and, pulling out anything that's rubble and just like refilling that area. And as a monolithic building material, it binds to itself pretty well. So it's not too bad. There are cob structures in England that are some of the oldest in the world, like the oldest in there, because they just, they're fine. You can also liquefy cob if you want. You can tear down walls, remix it, and then rebuild from there too. It's a reusable building material. I don't know if anybody's doing it anymore, but we had this idea back then of like you could build steel frames that are reusable, like that could be reusable for like 10,000 years, and then those are like Lego pieces, and then you could do a cob structure around that and rebuild the cob every, while. Somebody says, "Oh yeah, the oldest cob structure is 10,000 years." Is that like multi-generational living spaces in the Southwest, like Anasazi or something like that? Oh, cool. Very cool. Okay, that's cool to hear, Joel. Glad to hear. So let's see what else we got here. Oh, here's a great story. So back in this project was one of our first official intersection repair projects, and the project went like 90% of the way through its design process. And towards the very end of it, we were trying to do everything with consensus. One neighbor shows up who was like refusing to show up before. And he just basically tears the whole thing apart, says, "You can't do it. I'm gonna organize against you." And at first they were kind of scared. And we told them, "Okay, hold off. Like, this is part of your community. Let's talk to him." So we had a facilitated meeting, a little bit of conflict resolution, and it turned out that he just like kind of didn't feel included. And he was worried. He actually had a background as an activist, and he was worried that it was being pushed through too fast. He hadn't gotten word on it. He was worried some other people hadn't gotten word on it either, and he only had one tool, which is to say no. So he used it. And then it turned out that he actually was really creative and an artist. And when we included him, when we actually got him involved in the process, he did this. He put together, the whole project was based on Fibonacci sequences and all this sort of like sacred math. And so he was like, "I have just the idea. I'll build this gate that people can walk through when they come into the piazza." So this idea of like including the marginal and the fringe, like, and making sure that like you don't miss opportunity, because sometimes opportunity is like adversarial at first. It's good to kind of like remember examples of that. Here's another project that we did where a young man was hit by a truck on his bike. And so the bicycle community in Portland is very strong, and they tend to do spots that honor. So this was made as a shrine to him, like a memorial. with bike parts and a bike solar panel and this memorial structure and a spinning bicycle wheel that they built. That if you spin it, it tells the story of his life. This thing's still around, and now it's like 20 years old. It keeps getting rebuilt. So here we go. Here's some spaces. Here's some work. We've done a lot of stuff over the years, but this, in a lot of ways, was the project that really got me going. Taught me a little bit about what's possible, what community is possible, what we can make together, and the idea that the built environment and the social environment, that they interplay, that they're connected with each other, and that one can help the other. Because, man, there's so much more community organizing that can happen when you have a thing to work on. You know, this project spawned so many other projects. It spawned political campaigns. It spawned activist groups. It spawned nonprofits that have like continued in totally unique directions. Because it provided an example and it created a culture. And I gotta say, like, this nonprofit operates a little differently now, and there's other things happening with it. But the people who met during that time, they still get together. They still work. I still see them on the street sometimes, you know? So let's see if there's anything else. This is just me talking about how I learned. And okay, so one thing I do want to say about it is, I think in this thread I talk a little bit about issues I have with our work. So a lot of this happened before gentrification went haywire in Portland. There's always been sort of a process of white Portlanders pushing out people of color from neighborhood to neighborhood, but the city had and still does have, but had much more close to the center of the community, a vibrant community of black people, and at the same time also a really strong Mexican and Russian population. And during this period before heavy gentrification, the city was very it was a mosaic of different subcultures. And Southeast Portland was very white and did not tend to like try to do very much in Northeast Portland. And it was divided by very wealthy communities between that. And one thing I could say about our work at the time was that we took the stance of not wanting to impose on communities that we couldn't represent, as opposed to really thinking about what solidarity means. And part of that was our work was really like place specific, and it would have been inappropriate to bring our work into communities that were dealing with really different issues. But in hindsight, I wish that we had been there more for the changes that were coming. In the end, a lot of the work that we did was there because rent was cheap in Portland. It was really easy. You could work a few hours a month and pretty much pay your rent, and then spend the rest of the time doing organizing and making things and doing art and having underground concerts and secret cafes. And as rent has gotten more expensive and life has gotten more expensive, this culture wasn't able to sustain itself in the same way. So my main regrets are that we had this vision of the way that our city was going to go, and it seemed like it was going that way, but we were unrealistic in our understanding of what it actually meant to create something that could last over long periods of time. I think that those of us in Southeast ignored the racial and social injustices that were happening at the time. I think we understood they were happening. I think we had feelings about them. I think to the degree that we could be politically active, we were. But there was no cultural sense of how to actually go about doing that well. That's my assessment of where we were at. I think that the organization now, by its focus on racial justice, actually is doing a lot of the work that should have been done 10, 20 years ago. So I commend where the nonprofit has taken its energy now. And I think it is, especially in this day and age and this time, social justice comes first. So I've tried to learn my lessons and not repeat the same mistakes that we made back then. This was a good thread. I enjoyed revisiting the past about that. So I wanted to talk about one other thing while we're here. It's 7 o'clock. Yeah, I was going to talk for like another hour if people are cool with that. Does anybody have any questions about that presentation or about? I see ye. What say ye? Psychonaut, did you have something you were going to say? Oh, Joel. Well, I did record all of it, but the basic idea of how it got passed is covered in the thread. Not well though, but basically, we had created a meeting house that was really successful and become part of this sort of global justice thing that was happening, and it was allowed to last over a summer, and then the city shut it down. But the city at the time was pretty like cool with conversation, so we showed up at the city council meeting and said, "Oh no, we took over the street illegally and painted and built this example, this case study." And the city was like, "What are you doing? You can't do this." And so we showed up at city council and we explained how it met city goals. And the city said, "Okay, fine, temporary permit." And during that time, we drove around in a truck, setting up the seeds of the idea, feeding people, creating community all over the city with the message, we want to have this thing be permanent. And so that led to the dialogue that led to, like, we had thousands of people that were involved in the project by the end of it. And so many neighbors loved what we were doing. So it was pretty easy at the time and place that we were in the city, at the culture of the city, the fact that we had people like who were part of city government. Somebody asked who we were doing this with. Neighbors. So I'd say they became friends because people got to know each other. But it literally was the process of a group of neighbors finding each other, a larger existing community of artistic culture and resistance that was happening in Portland in the 90s. And over time, having events that were so human level and earnest and present with people that people were just welcome and invited. So they became friends, right? We weren't trying to have a brand. We weren't trying to push something. We were literally just like saying, "Come have tea with us on a weekly basis. Come join." And people would join because what else are you going to do on a Monday night? Hear saxophone players and poets and hang out with your friends. Yeah, it's so authentic. So really, like, authenticity is essential. Like, you're not going to fake this. You're not going to be able to, like, set up a scene or, like, a website. I mean, like, I'm doing Build Soil literally because we're all living online right now, and it's impossible, like, with the pandemic to go talk to my neighbors on the same level. But I still talk to all my neighbors. I still make sure that I interact with them. But doing something that people can just show up at. And so, like, eventually, I would love this stream and our Discord to be like that, to be like a meeting place. Where we can come together and actually start discussing, like, what's going on with us? How are we planting these trees? Like, what's next? Yeah, I think that's it. It's like, yeah, it's friends, but it's also not, like, escalating. Yeah, we need a lot of chestnut cookies. Man, I'm really excited about the, what are they called? The mesquite project down in Tucson, and they have pancake breakfasts with mesquite flour. I'm like, we're going to have some pancake chestnut breakfasts on a regular basis. So anyway, the permit was originally, it was a 90% approval in a 3-block radius, but we talked them down to 80% 2-block radius after we had done like 2 years of examples of the project. That permit, I can make that available. I'll find a way to, like, make that permit available because the text of it has been adopted by a number of other cities. Because it's pretty straightforward. Like, it's written by city people, right? Yeah, so Swanson's was talking about, like, is it friends? Is it neighbors? I think it's very easy for something like that to become a scene. It's very easy, especially if it's, like, all the same age group or, you know, to make and you're having fun doing it, to make sure that you're, like, you want to make sure that you're not creating a cool barrier. And that has to happen through, like, literally, it's almost like you have to, like, go in there and break up the divisions. Like, when there's at the beginning of driving that truck into the space, like, there's the people who are watching and the people who are, like, driving, and that's a barrier. So you have to go in there and have to be like, you guys come over here and you have to, like, help these people participate. And the moment somebody is, like, removed from the situation, you have to, like, say, no, you get to co-create this with whatever you're, like, bringing right now. So if you can't tell, I was really inspired by this project, and literally the way I conceive of changing the world right now is like, what if people just started planting chestnuts and then talking to each other, because there's a lot of barriers in the way of planting chestnuts. So you plant like 25 chestnut trees with your friends, and then you're like, okay, we've got 25 chestnut trees. I guess I have to go figure out how my city, like parks work, and if they want chestnut trees, and go talk to churches and go talk to this neighbor and that neighbor. So really, like with this project, I'm just giving people a challenge, and it's a little bit like stone soup, like you come with the big pot in the middle of town, and what are you making? Oh, I'm making stone soup. And they're like, oh, onions would be really good. I have onions, and they bring the onions. So we start with the chestnuts, and yada yada yada. Like we have to like do everything after that. We have to do everything in order to get chestnuts planted. And meanwhile, the world is being participated in. That's the idea. Any other questions before I? What kind of chestnuts? Are you asking Joel Syconaut? Or are you wanting... I just use the chestnuts I have. So I picked chestnuts in the neighborhood, and a lot of them were American Chinese mixes and Euro Chinese mixes, and some were just Chinese. And all of those work really well. Like, you have to add a little bit more sugar usually with the Chinese chestnuts, unless you age them. So my favorite thing is to like do a little aging, then dry, and then that flour is super sweet, and then you can make cookies and pancakes from that. Oh, Joel uses commercial flour. I'm grateful for everyone being here. Thank you for being here right now. Maybe I'll make this more entertaining in the future. But I want to change gears a little bit. And I want to use this thread. For everybody who's kind of new coming, this is just me trying out this space and seeing how it works. Oh, chestnuts and almond. Yeah, they go really well together. And also, I tried chestnuts with acorn flour, and it was a really nice mix. They balanced really well with the flavor of acorn. And they also helped the acorn texture be a little bit better. I was pretty impressed. I'm going to stop reading the chat because I'm like wanting to get into the conversation. We'll have to have one thing I've been wanting to have is sometime in like a month or two, start having a big Zoom meeting of everybody who's working on this kind of work, and we can just all be there, and it's not just me talking, but it's like everybody, the representations from Ohio and the representations from Massachusetts, can come and talk about what work they're doing. Oh my God, there's like recipes in the happening out there. Okay, I am gonna let's see. I'm going to read another one of these. So one of the first, well, this isn't one of the first, but a thread that I'm really proud of is this thread that's on Coppice Agroforestry. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time with it. Oh, somebody's saying something. I wonder if local nurseries would be a good way to disseminate chestnuts, or be willing to grow seedlings out to size. More everyday people would be excited to plant. So... there is the idea of like empowering people and having a little bit of a commercial operation so that people can like buy trees. It's amazing. You can get 25 chestnuts growing in an area that's 4 by 4. So you can take an area that's like 4 feet by 4 feet and do like a, half a foot of soil, just make a tiny raised bed, and you can stick 25 chestnuts, and that's a pound of chestnuts. And, that way you can keep it like covered if you need to from some squirrels, and you can water it, and you can keep your eye on it. And then you've got little starts, in a year that you can be giving out. So one of the things I've been encouraging people, and we're going to make like a video series just to like show how this is done, but it's really simple. You make a square, you put chestnuts directly in that soil. You don't worry about digging it. Oh, what do we have here? Hi there. Hi, Comrade Bubbles. The manager of the big local tree planting group said basically he couldn't buy appropriately sized chestnuts from any nurseries. What do you mean, Joel? Do you mean like the chestnuts were the wrong size for their planting? Interesting. Okay, but what I'm saying is that these trees, I have trees in my backyard that are now like that tall, but I've got ones that are like even taller than that. Oh wow, huge. Well, I like small ones because it's easier for me to fit them all in my backpack or in a truck. Um, we'll figure some stuff out. And also, if you have like a nursery connection and you can just get them to grow a bunch of trees, that's great. Only issue I think for a nursery is that they need a little bit more certainty in their lives. I feel like they need to know that there's going to be a financial turnaround, or people are going to be picking up the trees. If they're donating nursery space, I don't think they'd be into like what do you call it? Just growing something out and having this group of people who show up not taking the trees. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to talk about Coppice Agroforestry. So, climate hope. Walking around old managed landscapes, you might come across trees like these. Many thin trunks coming out of little stumps, or tall trees with knobby tops, with a lot of small branches popping up. These are coppices and pollards. All right, so just so you all know, I have one of those Chrome extensions that tells you when your images do not have alts. And because this is from me 2 years ago when I had bad alt practice, you're going to see a lot of like no alt shaming happening. It's okay. I've learned my lesson, and I like writing descriptions of videos right now, or of images. So these trees are all over the place, and it's funny because they became sort of part of like estates, or like, this idea of like. And when I was a kid, I would see trees like these, like especially pollards. Let's see. I would see pollards like these and just think that they were like abusing trees. Why are they coming every year and cutting these back like this? Like, let the trees be. And I've learned since that for a lot of trees, you end up losing. They die when they get to a certain size. Like alder trees, they only get so big. Birches. And when they get to a certain size, they no longer can handle the structure of their vascular system is designed, it's scaled for a smaller trunk. Yeah, and some trees can handle being coppice, that like can grow huge. Like chestnuts actually can grow huge, right? But if you keep cutting them back, it's almost like it renews them. And some of the oldest trees in Europe are stands of hazelnut and birch that are ancient, hundreds and hundreds of years old. So it's really interesting to think about collards and coppices because they're all over. The other night on the Discord, we watched a video about Japanese Coppice agroforestry of chestnuts. And they go and they clear an area, cut the trees down to the stump, and then let them regrow. And they use the poles for mushroom logs and sometimes for construction too, though the video didn't feature that. So when you're looking at these plants, what's happening is that they've been cut back and they're regrowing. So it's just interesting to kind of like think about what they are, because they often are found, the Forestry Department of British Columbia has a whole manual devoted to cultural trees, culturally modified trees, CMTs. And culturally modified trees are, well, they're of cultural significance. So you have to halt land use changes and bring in archaeology, anthropology, and First Nations. And trees that have been culturally modified are absolutely essential parts of recognizing occupancy, land ownership, use rights, and the idea of that natural systems are somehow devoid of humanity. That what we think of as natural systems are places that have been consistently occupied and tended for so long that the ice ages were there and the people were there before the plant communities arrived. So here I am. They meet a lot of needs. They grow a lot of thin poles for wood, for many uses. They build huge root masses, can fit between other trees, and take advantage of the fast early growth of some of the hardwood trees, and they sequester carbon extremely quickly. Because what happens is when you cut them back, their root system is there. And the trees needing to grow back wood quickly. And so one of the things that the trees do is they dump hydrocarbons sugars, proteins, and carbohydrates. And they do that to feed the microbe communities. And the microbe communities grow fast with all of that excess sugar, protein, carbs. And they go and they start mining nutrients out of the soil and bring that back to the tree. And the tree then uses that to rapidly regrow. And during that process, it's rapid photosynthesis and it's sequestering and sucking more carbon out of the air. One can go all over the world and see this kind of relationship between people and their regrowing trees. People have done this everywhere. It's a kind of relationship to the earth that is symbiotic and worth reconnecting with. So the concept is simple. Many trees all over the world don't live very long once they get big. But when they're browsed by animals, they stay young and can live for a long time. When we coppice or we pollard, we cut trees back on a regular schedule. So here's an example. You've got the trees, and every couple years, these hazels are being cut back, and they regrow. And a pollard is done usually above head height. Nope, somebody said the times I cut my first chestnut coppice, it comes back fast. Yeah, chestnuts are like immediate comeback. There's a big old chestnut tree was cut down nearby me, and every time I walk by it, it's just it just looks like this massive planting. It looks as thick as like me planting 20 chestnuts right next to each other, all coming out of one stump. So this is a pollard, and pollards are up high, and part of the reason for this is that they were adapted to be part of cattle systems, and also to keep deer from eating the poles. So if you do the same thing up high, you get this tree, and all of this new poling comes high up, and so it can happen outside. Oh, hey, Moira. I'm just going through some of my threads and talking about a little bit about the project to people as I practice this space. It's so nice to have all of you here. So this was a typo. When they're taken down to a stump, they dump carbon into the soil and feed their team of microorganism friends, which helps them feed them on the materials they need to rejuvenate. So, how long does that push back nut production? Yeah, so in terms of nut production, there's a couple things going on, right? So the life cycle, here's the life cycle of nut production for a tree. A chestnut tree is like, it wakes up, right? It's sprouting, and about 3 years into it, or to 4 years, depending on the variety, it will start producing flowers. And if there's another chestnut nearby, it can start producing nuts. But usually we plant chestnut trees kind of far from each other. We plant them, ultimately we want them like 25 feet or more. That's kind of far for a 3-year-old tree to get pollinated well. An alternative is you plant them at 5 feet centers, and then they can get pollinated quickly. But you're still only going to get a handful of chestnuts those first few years. And it isn't until like year 10 that you actually start getting some regular production. Oh, somebody says the biggest hurdle is getting older trees. Yeah, I don't know. I think you just start young and we're just think ahead for the future. I'm like, I don't even know how to think about the old trees are so expensive if you want big trees. And it's a big investment in time and energy. So, where was I with that? The chestnuts take, so long to grow. Well, if you cut them back, they have to go through that same cycle, the little branches are going to have to get to like, yeah. So one way of thinking about it is you do what I said, like 5 feet, 10 feet. And as the trees get bigger, they get to the spot where they're starting to like hit each other's crowns. Then you can thin between them. So now you've got like trees that are farther apart from each other with stumps between. And then you let that grow. And so now you've got poles coming out of the understory for wood and biomass. And you've got the bigger trees. Well, you do that the first cycle. Now you've got trees that are bigger and they're getting a little too close. So you thin again. So now you've got a cycle of multiple sizes of trees with huge trees growing at like 25 feet. Maybe some longer cycle coppices between them, and then some like fast cycle coppices between those. And different plants have different rates of speed. But one of the nice things about this is you also get these like nice fast growth poles. Yeah, somebody's talking about Yeah, and also the opposite. The trees that are on like 20-year coppice cycle between the big ones also can add pollen and genetic diversity to the big stand. And here's the other benefit: if you have disease or death, or just like one of the big trees dies, you have the option of some of those younger coppices that can be like taken down to just 1 liter, and they can become the big tree on the next cycle. So just like a forest ecosystem, there's all these like baby trees that are sort of like waiting. You go under chestnut forests, and there's all these chestnuts that have just sprouted, and they're like 40 years old, and they're just like waiting to get big. So I just soil food web is always at the core of what I think about, and this is a very simplistic soil food web. We know more, there's more going on, but basically plants, and through their death and through their roots, feed fungi and bacteria. These are the primary ones that we want. So the fungi tend to go for, they like nutrients that are farther apart from each other, which is why they can grow these sort of like lengthy bodies. And bacteria need food supplies that are like present in one location. So bacteria tend to show up in places where there are all the things they need are in one place, and fungi have a little bit more versatility. But the fungi and the bacteria are eating, taking on these nutrients from the plants that the plants are feeding them, and they lock onto them. They tend to not give them back up, which is why unfinished compost sometimes can like starve a plant of nutrients, just simply because the growing microbes are holding on to all of their nutrients. So we need to have a healthy community of things that eat those fungi and bacteria, which are protozoa, nematodes, insects. And what they do is they help release those nutrients back to plants. But plants are always doing this. They're pumping nutrients, growing communities, and then they're being fed back the nutrients gathered by those organisms in that process. I forgot that I was supposed to talk about this in this section. So trees don't always live very long, can become some of the oldest trees, and there's ancient coppices. So here's an ancient British coppice, or a funny looking one, and some of the oldest trees in British woods are coppice stools, which may be more than 1,000 years old. So it's weird. Pollarding has been part of gardens where people just like to look like they're English lords, right? And it can be done just for appearance. The purpose is to have pollards that are out of reach of animals and livestock. So here's, you can keep all of this stuff out. And also you can grow trees for forage for animals and be able to go up there and chop and feed them as you need. This is sort of like reenacting the ancient relationship between trees and tall grazing animals, browsing animals. Tree hay, yeah, right. That's one of the terms. So having found the power of these amazing trees, we can also point into the direction of how so many cultures also see this as a sacred cycle of death and renewal. There are traditions all over the world of the world tree that's coppiced at the end of time and regrows. For example, the Norse. And ash I know, Yggdrasil is its name, with water white is the great tree wet. Thence come the dews that fall in the dales, green by earth's well does it ever grow. Thence come the maidens, mighty in wisdom, 3 from the dwelling down neath the tree. Earth is one named, Verthandi the next. On the wood they scored, and sculled the third. Laws they are made, and life allotted to the sons of men, and sets their fates. So this is the story of trees planted right where the waters collect, above the wells. And the fates collect the sap of the world tree, which causes everything to flow in nature. So these stories of these cultures are all cultures that are standing in woodlots in front of trees, and they cut them down and they regrow. And the world itself is viewed on the same cycle. We are making the world when we do that. So many cultures understand how to renew the plants and land in their lives, and they connect then with the large cycles of renewal, the potential that things could go from ego to world chaos, and the ability to be part of the dance that brings a part of maturity with nature. When I'm giving these long threads, I really try to have a moment of rest in the middle of them. So how do we bring back lessons from this? What can be done in the world with reconnecting with this knowledge? Well, one thing is we get really straight poles, whips, sticks of whatever size that we can manage at different sizes and scales. So we can get baskets and tool handles and chairs and houses, the materials, and fuel for stoves and charcoal. Here's Ben Law in England, who's been bringing back a lot of Coppice systems in England. These things that you can make with whips and poles. And just to remind people, this is a little bit of a pledge drive, so we could totally use some donations. We have a link here in the chat of how to donate directly through PayPal, but we also have a Patreon where we're trying to get a regular donation happening to support our efforts. So please look us up at patreon.com/buildsoil. So, unlike some forestry, you're not just taking and leaving destruction in your wake. You're leaving roots with living soil. You're keeping the integrity of relationship. So here's all of this wood production happening, but the roots are still there. And ultimately, you're helping cycles of renewal in the forest. There's an author, Dave Jackie, who at the time when I wrote this, Mushroom Log Heaven. Yeah. Dave Jackie's working on a Coppice book. What I found out recently is he has moved that to his writing partner, and I think he's left the project, but he left his notes. He's working on a Coppice book and has returned with many important examples. We can even do this with Christmas trees. I want to show this this video. It's 10 minutes long. I'm not going to do the whole thing. So this is a Christmas tree production place that's doing the exact same thing with coppicing. Instead of digging up, which if you ever been to a Christmas tree farm, they dig super deep. So
they harvest greens for wreaths and garlands, but they do that from the same tree over and over and over again, using a coppicing strategy that I didn't even know was possible. See, it turns out that even conifers, when they're damaged by storm or ice, they can resprout from dormant buds on the branches and in the trunk, and those sprouts can grow again into Christmas trees that can be cut again and again and again from the same tree, as long as you leave a skirt of branches to keep the stump alive. You can get multiple trees off of each stump for many, many years. Al Pirapan began planting in 1954, and the same trees that he planted in the 1950s, 50 years old now, are still producing Christmas trees and greens on this farm. Now, Al's getting up to his 80s, and he's letting Emmett and Cecilia Van Driesch lease part of the 5 acres of the 10 acres, along with their daughter Eliza May, and they're bringing that 5 acres back into full production.
Okay, so
Christmas tree growing.
I don't know if this song is licensed or not, so be careful about it. But you basically can see that like the way it's set up is you can do a massive amount of tree production, wood production, and even make products like Christmas trees. Like we could be doing Christmas trees in a way that was actually about increasing the sequestration patterns, and then using those Christmas trees for compost, wood, mushroom growing, construction, all those kinds of things. We don't have to change the culture 100%. People are going to buy Christmas trees in the short run. We could be doing it in strategies that are a little bit smarter. So we return to our homes, communities, neighborhoods, towns. I bet we could turn a lot of our streets and parking strips, highways, yards, parks, campuses towards this amazing tactic for building a lot of carbon-rich wood for many uses. So then I always kind of conclude with this kind of thing. So thanks for coming along. We can work on this together to coppice the plants we already have, to plant more, to shift to living with the carbon flows of the biosphere, to change ourselves in the process, and to engage directly with the restoring the balance of the atmosphere. And I wonder, as you go about your daily life, if you see some trees that might be coppice, do they already grow with that pattern? What would it mean to turn our place into carbon pumps? Where could you and your community reconnect with the vegetation right around you? So There's been some cool proposals around this in Vermont. There's been a proposal in a couple different communities of taking the highways and the doing coppice production all throughout, as where there normally is like trees that are already being managed and cut back. And so you could start having it so that there was this regular pumping in order to build huge amounts of biomass over time. The net gain on those kinds of systems is you really do increase just through active mimicking of grazing or of browsing. So, that's a cool approach that I think we should be looking at more and thinking as part of our work. So I have time for one more of these, and I'm curious if anybody has any questions before I move on to the next one I want to talk about. I want to talk about one that sort of feeds from this. So one example of what happens when you actually have an effective forest system that is pumping out enough biomass that you can do something about it. Because I live here in the city, and it's amazing. Every day walking around my neighborhood, there are tree trimmers almost any week of the year. And there's all of this, trees that are being grown in the city. And one thing about urban trees is they tend to not quite live as long, right? They have restrictions for how well their roots do, and they have to grow underneath sidewalks. So there's a constant sort of need to reset trees. And we do that through, mostly through just shaping them. We could be doing a lot more coppice work. We could be bringing trees down all the way down to a stump, or doing pollards a little bit more than we do. But either way, there's this vast flow of carbon that is already sort of happening. And tree trimmers have to pay to dump those trees often. They become part of municipal compost systems, but a lot of those systems are so intensive that they go anaerobic and are not nearly as effective compost. A lot of what you get from city compost is not a real compost. It's not a good biological community. And often they have a lot of toxic byproducts, just caused by going for the anaerobic route rather than the aerobic route. So even urban areas, as well as their surrounding areas, could be actively producing woody materials that we could be doing a lot of things with. And, one of the first things that people go for is they think, well, I've got these sticks, I'm going to burn them in a stove. That could be our fuel. And there is something to be said for having a heating system that's wood-based or biomass-based, because it's, recent atmosphere has become part of the tree, and then the wood gets burnt and goes back into the atmosphere, and it's a relatively fast cycle, so it doesn't potentially have the same impact. But there are issues with that. Ideally, what you'd really want is a way of extracting that heat that keeps, as an after effect, increased carbon storage and increased biological fecundity. So this example is an example of using tree trimmings and scraps and cuttings from trees and chips, and creating heat extraction that ultimately also creates massive amount of biomass storage. Looks like we've lost a lot of people. It is getting late on the East Coast. Somebody says, there's a ginkgo around the corner from me that got hit by a car and accidentally pollarded. So I've been dealing with that, so it doesn't just get dug up and replaced. Adopt an ugly tree near you. It's true. People just aesthetically decide that one type of regrowth isn't ideal. It might be worth actually doing a bit of cutting back even more. So I'm just going to read through this. I'm really grateful for everyone who's stuck around for this. Next week, we're going to have a more formal presentation about white chestnuts and what we can do, and to rally the cry for this spring so that we can get people moving together on getting 1 million chestnut trees planted in a relatively short amount of time. We can feed so many people just by creating the opportunities of 1 million trees out there in the next couple years, so that we can have many millions of trees soon after. Nope. This is a good time of year to order from Chip Drop. Yeah, definitely go for Chip Drop, or even just walk around and talk with your local tree trimmers. I tend to just find people and hand them my number and my address, and one day they show up and they drop 10 yards of something. And just remember to tell them that in general for your garden you don't want conifers or laurel, because both of those can interfere, or eucalyptus can be a little annoying. Yeah, Chip Drop often never comes by. That's my one issue with that place. What I find is that it works, but what works even more is literally just going and talking to people. and also offering them a little bit of cash. I know, but 20 cubic yard. Well, 20 cubic yards is a lot. Draw them a map. It's maybe my advice, and also it's a good excuse to talk to your neighbors and getting them to move this stuff. I had a volunteer come and work in the project for a while, and the day that they showed up, like 10 yards got dropped in my street. And I was like, I guess we're not taking care of the chestnuts today. We're moving wood chips. And that has led to some of the nicest soil that I have ever seen, because we took a couple days of moving those with wheelbarrows. Okay, I'm going to look at this. So in 1970s, this guy, in the Mediterranean climate of the Provence region in southern France, a woodlot manager developed a way to generate energy from trimming tree systems while also making incredible soil. His name was Jean Pan, and his work is important for our future. So Jean Pan, like, I first heard about him when I was a teenager reading Mother Earth News. And there were like all these articles about this guy. He had just died in the 80s. So he's this, he's in this climate that's very similar to the driest parts of California. And the soil production there is naturally pretty terrible. Like, it ends up being sort of like dry forests, that are fire adapted, and the rate of soil production is, it's pretty low. Soil requires a good balance of air and water, and this just does not have the water supply. So he was working and grabbing huge amounts. He took care of a forest with an area with dry summers. He was interested in finding ways to convert wood that was cleared to reduce fire load into compost. So he invented a chipper system to make uniform chipped woods, and his family still sells them. So one thing about the fires that happen in parts of California and western parts of Oregon, we have these landscapes where fire is a regular part of renewal. Like the ecosystem produces a lot, but it's what's called a brittle climate, where for a large part of the year we don't have decomposition. And so decomposition for us happens in the cold part of the year. So there's a little bit of there's a huge fungal push in the fall, right, and in the spring, and then things dry out. So those ecosystems traditionally have been fire managed, and managed by people who clear the trees and thin them and do winter burns in order to make sure that there's a slower cycle, like less fire, and a little bit more, a little bit more useful fire. Native people here often will burn in order to actually open up the light to berry thickets and to get the understory growth really nice and lush. So Jean Pan was in a similar ecosystem, and he was trying to figure this out. So he made these chippers, these crazy chippers, and they're called a drum shredder. So what they do is they shred the wood. They actually create it into almost like spaghetti, which allows. So when you chop wood, there's actually fungal inhibitors that wood puts out, the trees put out, and it's to stop fungi. And if you shred it, you minimize the exuding of that, and you help sort of like make it a little bit quicker of a biological process. So what they did, let's see what I wrote. He noticed that chip piles heat up as microorganisms do the work of decomposing. He wanted to find a way to use that. So he made huge piles. He made these piles that are like 20 feet wide and 10 feet high. And they would go and clear out a section of the forest they were going to be clearing anyway. And they would make these heavy, like compacted piles, and add tons of water. Like, it was a lot of water, but it was only once. So here's some examples of smaller ones, but this is more the size of what he was doing. And this is funny. So he also then he went to California and he met this guy. Oh, here we go. I talk about here. He got interested in biogas. So he met John Freed, who was like the pioneer of biogas at the time in California, who taught him his technique. And so he started integrating them. One of the issues with biomass is you need heat in order to make sure that you're creating methane from anaerobic processes. So he just stuck an anaerobic methane generator in the middle of one of these piles to make use of that heat. You don't have to do this for this technique, but it's kind of cool that he added that into it. So he'd put in his anaerobic, he'd put wet compost into that, he'd seal it up, and he would bury it underneath the pile. And they would put coils that would take the house's water system and run it through the compost pile as much as possible. And then it would run hot water back into the house. Meanwhile, the biogas is producing methane, which is going into inner tubes. There was a compressor as well, and then that's being used in order to be the gas for the house, whether that's gas heat or whether that's for the stoves. So what's funny here is that he actually had a truck that he tried to design that was running on biogas, and this is like a tank of methane that he's trying to use to run his truck. I saw his interview. I saw an interview with his nephew who said, yeah, my uncle stopped that eventually because it kept exploding. But I'm sure that somebody could engineer a gas power, like a biogas powered vehicle. It just, Champagne couldn't do it in his garage. So, yeah, many Americans first learned about his work from this article in Mother News. And here's an example of his like inner tube system for storing biogas. But the interesting thing is the hot water. So, and there was this German documentary that was made. It's actually worth looking at. Let's see how long it is. Okay, it's a little long for our purposes. But I can show a section of it.
Auch ein Franzose mit Biogas unabhängig gemacht. Ist Inspektor für ein
here's his
größeres
pile. I'm going to turn
Waldgebiet
the
im
volume down
Departement Var in
So he had this gigantic pile, and you can totally make a pile that's like a small... Yeah, somebody's saying just a small issue keeps exploding. Yeah, you can do this system without the biogas. And biogas works for your home. I just wouldn't recommend it for a truck. So he built these things. They cut... Here's the forest. They're cutting the forest down. And so his system was so insane, you don't have to do it at this level. Let's see. I've got a good image. So here's them running the pipes through. It's so funny because it's Germans talking about French people, but...
Der Gärraum ist luftdicht verschlossen. Der Kompost kann also nun gären und wie im Steinerschen System Bio...
Alright, so the second part of this actually shows them using it.
Und Wärme.
So this system, here we go.
Umfassender Haufen birgt 40 Tonnen Häckselgut und 20 Tonnen Wasser. Er produziert inzwischen Gas und Wärme.
So it's only 40 yards of wood chips would do this.
Die Temperatur im Innern steigt auf über 60 Grad. Egal, ob die Sonne
So it produces consistent heat and heats the water to just below boiling.
Heißes Wasser konnte aus solchen Meilern hier schon 18 Monate lang herausgeholt werden. Dadurch hat Jean-Pain 4.000
He saves 4,000 liters of oil for heating with this.
Außerdem erzeugt der Gärraum
And they're getting biogas. So they use the biogas to heat the almost boiling water to get it to boiling really quickly, so it's an efficient use of the gas as well.
Verständlich, dass Jean-Pain und seine Frau Ida einigermaßen stolz sind auf ihr System zur Nutzung der Sonnenenergie.
Grâce à la chaleur obtenue par le compost de broussailles, nous de l'eau chaude sur les pieds.
Dank der Wärme aus dem Holzkompost habe ich hier nun warmes Wasser. Es ist 60 Grad warm und ich werde es nur mit dem Gas aus dem Holzmeiler zum Kochen bringen, um uns einen Tee zu machen.
There we go. So you can have your nice cup of tea powered by the fuel. Here he is.
Que nous donne le compost de broussailles. Cette matière première précieuse.
Es sind schon außergewöhnliche Möglichkeiten, die der Kompost aus dem Gestrüpp des Waldes uns bietet.
So, one thing that's cool is the after results of this is that you get soil as a result. And the soil's extremely nice. Like, it's some of the nicest soil you can imagine. So they've been producing all of their food from the soil that was produced by this process. So they extract the heat, and they have this incredible ability to improve the fecundity of the landscape.
denn sie liefern einen wertvollen Pflanzendünger. Warum der an Stickstoff so arme Holzkompost Gemüse so gut düngen kann,
Yeah.
das ist eine Frage, die inzwischen auch belgische Wissenschaftler beschäftigt.
So I can answer this, which is that since then what we've learned is that a lot of microbes actually have the ability to grab nitrogen when they need it. And so part of that decomposition process, when it's done really well, there is nitrogen being brought in from the air by the microbes to facilitate the process. So you can take pure wood chips, and if you have enough of a consistent composting process, you will be able to get some of that atmospheric fertility. And fungi are really good at that process too. So, and trees do have these sugars. They do have this capacity to break down the wood. So his work is incredible. And so here we go. Those media tended to focus on the water heating system, which is like super neat. So one thing I want to say is you can use smaller piles of wood, and you can have a little bit of nitrogen that you add in order to speed up the process. You just need to then make the pile less often. His piles lasted for, I believe, 15 to 18 months, and they would give consistent amounts of large amounts of hot water. So there are benefits to thinking on that scale. But if you're doing a faster cycle, you could do a smaller pile. I've had showers from small piles that are like 6 feet tall, you know. But there's this great visit that some people did to his nephew's place. And one thing I just wanted to show about that is that so they go visit him, and he's like, wait a second, let me show you why we did this. It wasn't for the heat. This isn't agricultural land, right? He's only added Champagne compost. So the after effects of heating your home. Here we go. This is like the action shot of this. He's like, look what I got here. I gotta tell you, as like a soil appreciator, this is phenomenal soil. Like, I would die for this kind of. This is incredible soil.
Et là, on voit, par exemple, où il n'y a pas de compost, bon, l'air, il n'y a pas de compost, il n'y a pas de culture, l'herbe va se développer spontanément.
He says he gets weeds.
On va mettre une plantation en place. La plantation.
And one thing that's a sign of is it shows that the compost is such high quality that it has a healthy microbe community that's actually utilizing a lot of those nutrients. And so the nutrients are not readily available to weed plants. Instead, they're in forms that tend to be more appreciated by vegetables and more fungal-loving plants like trees. So it's an extraordinarily stable soil, and it's a soil which can handle weedy plant species, and it has so much fungi that it's not going to be full of mustards, and unless you choose to grow, a kale, which can handle that. But a lot of the weedy mustards really prefer actinomycetes rather than fungi. So this ability to take wood and take the need we need from it, heat, which is something we use a lot of fuel for, and then being able to turn it into something that is activating the capacity of the subsoil to take on organic matter and the capacity of that soil to hold water, all of the amazing functions of soil that this is capable of moving on. And to be able to do this as part of a function of reducing fire load is pretty outstanding. Hey, Weaponized Discourse. So this is the tail end of a long series of presentations that I've been giving. It's nice to have you here. We're going to wrap up, I think, I'm going to wrap up in 20 minutes. So here we go. Jean-Pen's nephew still talking.
Coloniser le sol et ne va pas permettre à d'autres végétaux de s'installer.
Yeah, exactly. Like carrot heaven.
Comme dans un jardin classique. Ça, c'est le sol de l'année passée. Donc là, là, il a été préparé donc avec la machine. Donc on a passé un petit coup de rotatif et là, la plantation a été mise en place. Alors, c'est vraiment mou. voilà, tiens, par exemple là.
Over on the Discord, somebody was asking, like, oh, is it the problem to burn fuel in order to make wood chips? And I'm like, yeah, it uses some carbon, but look what the results are.
Donc on a un développement racinaire qui est très important, qui va coloniser le sol, mais qui va permettre dans les zones sèches d'avoir un petit...
Oh, I'm glad to see that.
De capter toute l'eau qui est disponible quand il pleut pas.
So for everyone who just arrived, this landscape is like dry California, and he's managing this through active transformation of tree waste.
Le champignon a une action, les bactéries ont une action, et je pense que l'un ne se passe pas de l'autre. On reproduit.
Okay, this is a great video. I recommend people watch more of it. He's so interesting. So, here's me like fanboying about the soil. I mean, this is great soil. Look at this soil. Like I wish my soil was this nice. I mean, when we had 115-degree temperature in Oregon last year, I just thickly mulched, and it was amazing to reach down and see like the heat of the weather was actually speeding up the decomposition, and there was like you could feel the mulch turning into soil. It was and after that, like the ground was amazing. Like the heat wave actually improved our soil where we had thick mulch. So he ended up getting really excited about a larger integrated view of how homes would be able to work and be supported through forest care in a rotation where coppiced wood could be used to make these systems, and the result is gardens. So in his, wild system, you would have this 3,000 meter area of forest. I mean, this is like, it's a lot of forest and it's a lot of landscape. So obviously we're not going to do this one-to-one in urban environments, but there are everywhere in California, everywhere in Oregon, there are large tracts of land that used to have human care to manage and to keep biomass and to turn it back into like the understory and into fecundity. We could be doing this. And in urban areas, we can be doing smaller versions of that. So he broke it into these 40-hectare areas and had lots of paths through them. And he would go on a rotation, thinning the forest, going along this grid. And I don't know how often it was. Oh, here we go. Every 8 years for a period of at least 24 years. It's not a question of turning a forest into an orchard, but of selecting plots averaging 40 hectares, which is 625 meters on the side, and to which access is possible. Each of these well-defined plots has a potential of 1,600 tons of brushwood. So imagine we were actively gardening our landscapes and slowly pulling out biomass. And then in urban areas, planting our parks this way, planting our highways and streets this way. We could be actively planting trees everywhere and doing this kind of work, and then turning it back into part of our flow of heating. And then the end result is gardens and food production. Things scale. You got to think about what type of environment. And that's only one configuration, one solution for the context, but it's still an interesting example. Let's see what this is. Okay, he's got his grid of 40 hectares, 25 zones, all of which is being harvested every 8 years. Each 40-acre area provides 2,000 tons of brushwood, about 50 tons per hectare. And at 50 tons, that's a couple of those piles. So, amazing. So what do we take from this? We apply it into the context we're in. Others have shown really interesting projects with much smaller piles, or mixing it in with other kinds of compost, which has to be rebuilt more often. This guy, Galen Brown, has done a lot of books, and his book here, The Compost-Powered Water Heater, is actually really sweet. And he shows engineering examples and test plots of tiny piles and piles that are integrated with greenhouses and piles that are integrated with homes and piles that are at different sizes, So it's pretty great. I have a vision when I finally get a place that I get to design. I want to have a unit where I have a consistent compost heating pile, but the hot water does not just go to the faucet. It also is on a continuing cycling through the earthen floor of a house, so that you're getting this transfer of heat from the compost pile into the earthen floor to bring the radiant heat in the home a little bit higher. And you should look up Galen Brown if you're interested in this stuff, because he's been doing a lot of experiments with other kinds of systems. He tends to favor smaller with more nitrogen. which is cool. You know, there's things that you could say about that. You got to get that nitrogen somehow. That takes space and time and energy. So, you know, there's always trade-offs with whether you're going to put more work in or not. I recommend starting and trying it with the least work option first. And if it's good enough, there you go. If it's better, it can always be improved. You can also do something like integrate compost toilet urine systems into this. And this heat will like take care of your waste and make sure that it's, biologically sterile. Gets rid of pathogens, that kind of thing. So you could be integrating, municipal toilet systems and not polluting water supplies while also doing this. A lot of us live in cities with a lot of wood chippers running all the time. If we design for coppice and planting for production of carbon, we can also use that wood not just for construction, but for heating homes, generating some of our energy, and to grow fertility of our gardens. I think this is important. A lot of these solutions are actually like about tapping into something that's already happening. Like we currently are using fossil fuels to chip trees. It's just part of like the management of our world. That's a stream that already could be repurposed for first extraction of heat and second, making incredible soil and then growing food and then like on and on and on and on until we've changed enough things. So there was an idea in Portland, where I live, that schools could be generators of geothermal heat and solar energy on their properties. So they have this idea that schools own all of these lots, with tracks and stuff. Why not dig down and actually like extract thermal heat with heat pumps? They could also be locations for holding and converting large piles of delivered chips. Another idea is converting driveway spaces into compost water heaters. Another factor is that this is a way to extract energy without burning most of the carbon away. While there is CO2 released by the organisms to do their job, much of the heat is coming from the processes of soil building. Jean Pan died in 1981, and most of the attempts to explore his work have tried to do exactly what he did, but ultimately he was an innovator and experimenter, and an important piece of our puzzle in thinking about how we rapidly grow biomass and store it as life-improving soil we need. So something I want us to do is to set aside this notion that we can pollute through living while mitigating somewhere else, right? All of these like carbon trading schemes, they're all built on this concept that you like do bad here, but then you pay back good here. And it's sort of like self-flagellating after you've like done a wrong. Instead, I want to say we can do right to begin with. We can start living so that human need is actually met regeneratively. There's so many things that we need. Why do we make them sins that then we have to do Hail Marys about, So maybe it's time to take this idea of coppice and the ways we use coppice for fast sequestration. Like, remember, we can speed up the sequestration of trees through regular coppice. And we have ways that we heat, and we have the need for soil, and we can heat, construct, and grow food using it. And we can integrate it back into the design of towns and settlements. Oh, and then I just, like, at the end of this, I just said, oh yeah, and Californians, this is how you reduce fire load, by housing people. You have people housed, and they manage the thinning, and then they make goods and compost from the coppice. So, those are the presentations I wanted to give today. Are there any thoughts or questions from the people who have stuck around with me for 2 hours? I really appreciate everybody being here. Remember, this is me trying to fundraise for our nonprofit to plant 1 million chestnut trees. So please consider making a donation and keep following us. And next week we will be doing a much more like focused presentation with slides on questions about why chestnuts and how chestnuts, and also a vision for what we're going to be doing this spring, both here, and we have 450 people on our Discord currently. So we are mobilizing those people all over the country to form groups to plant chestnuts and things like mesquite and other trees in other places. And build the social capacity, the ability to work together and the ability to go meet our neighbors so that we can get 1 million trees easily planted. And then from there, man, we can take on so many other projects. So planting 1 million chestnuts is step one. So, any other questions or comments before I kind of take us out? If anyone asks you about your pollard looking weird, just tell them you're doing yard scale bonsai. but you're not very good at it. They could be made a little prettier. Like there is an art. I know there's an art of like, and also you could also like do the bougie thing. You can say like, oh, I'm trying to look like I'm a British lord. And bonsais, and there's all this like human modification. It's very weird that it gets abstracted and becomes this like separated thing. But bonsai is also an art of understanding how like extreme conditions transform the shape of trees. Like those tiny trees that could be giant trees that are like stuck on rocks. It's amazing what plants actually are evolved for. And we seem a little addicted to things ideal form. Oh, Psychonaut is making a Siberian pea bush living fence right now. That's cool. If people don't know, Siberian pea is a really great nitrogen fixer. It definitely coppices really well. And it's very easy to get it to join to itself. I don't know if you're doing Belgian fence kind of grafting, but you can make that thing into like a wood lattice, and then you can keep you can keep zombies at bay because nothing can get through the living fences made from that. Yeah, and they're incredible animal fodder. They're such a nice nitrogen fixer that they produce a ton of nitrogen. I mean, imagine pollarding a living fence and using that as part of your like biomass in your heating. But one of the nice things about all that nitrogen is that gets put into protein. And so if you're trying to grow a living animal, it's nice to start accumulating some proteins. Joel is trying to establish sea berries and yapon. Yeah, those are really nice too. How's your yapon doing? Do you have an estimate or goal for how many trees for a certain dollar amount? Like how many chestnut trees does $100 amount to? You mean like in my donation process? The pandemic has changed it all for us because we're investing a lot of energy in trying to keep this project going and also trying to grow to a pretty large scale. But you yourself, like if you wanted to just plant 25 chestnuts, it tends to cost, it's a pound of chestnuts from a source, and most of the time that's going to be about $10. So you can plant 25 to 30 chestnuts for $10, and if you're lucky, let's say 30 chestnuts for $10. So that's like 30 cents. So you need a little bit of space, and maybe each of those trees is a quarter, and you gotta water them because they're babies. So I recommend actually putting them in a shaded area. People always plant their baby trees in a sunny area because the trees ultimately want to be sunny. But you don't want big trees, right? Like you don't want them to all grow too big and you have to dig them out. So you keep them in the shade. Mulch them really thick so you don't even have to water too much. The one regret I have is I did top watering, and I wish I had installed a soaker hose that I could put under the mulch, because that would have meant the water level could have even been less. But so there you go, 4 by 4 feet pile of compost. You buy nice soil because it's only 4 by 4 by half a foot. Put some mulch on top of that. Hey kid. Tables have turned. Now you can mass post weird diagrams on my Twitch. So yeah, you do that. You plant all those in the small area. So that's pretty cheap, right? Like, I mean, you need the land. For us, honestly, the price of our chestnuts has gone up over time. I bulk bought, so my trees were a lot cheaper to begin with. But I've been doing the effort of taking care of them and getting them to a bigger size so that we can give them to Native community in Western Washington and the church groups that we're handing them out to. So our per tree amount has ended up being a little expensive, but we're also investing energy in things like publications and writing and making sure that other people have the skills they can do this. So you're also sort of like financing other people. Like you're helping me support our larger community of people. We're making videos and resources for that. Oh, everyone's talking about caffeine in the subjects. I have a strong opinion about the family of Yapon that I don't think I can actually say publicly, which is I think we should all invite toxicologists to share with us their real thoughts about what is and isn't toxic in that family. I would love to talk to a holly toxicologist and get the skinny by somebody who can make a statement. All right. Well, the conversations that are happening here are amazing. Remember, we have a Discord. I also am a nonprofit, so I have to be careful about certain statements. Yeah, we're trying our best to make things continue and happen. I would love some feedback on this. If you want to write me, my email is jordanbuildsoil@gmail.com, and our website is going to be launched in the next few days, and we're expecting to be doing a lot more like please fund us kind of messages for next week, while I also give sort of like a state of the project and like where we're going next presentation. And continue to look at the resources we're trying to put together. Most of my communication for the last few years has been on our Twitter account, but we're going to keep doing it. And also, once we get these like projects in place and we have experiences in place, we will be having a huge amount of nuts. So like all the trees I give away, I'm intentionally going through a vetting process. I make sure that we're not giving trees to people who are doing ongoing commercial operations. So there's been a few times where somebody's been like, I can take care of 100 trees, and I've done a little bit of an interview. And it turns out they're trying to start a commercial chestnut operation. And the truth is, if you're going to start a commercial chestnut operation, like, let's do it. That's awesome. But it's not gonna be the effort that we're supporting for free. So our 8,000 trees that we've given away so far, those are all to people who have made a pledge that have said these trees are going to go to community. They're going to go to feeding local community food systems. Some of them are schools, and we're going to feed the children that are at this school. And some of them are like, we're going to be providing food for neighbors in our neighborhood, or we're going to provide food for the local food bank. And I've been really trying to collect recipes. Because there's so many recipes, and I keep meeting children of Italian immigrants who are like, Grandma said I have to plant chestnuts, I have to grow chestnuts, and they make cake, and they make flour, and they make pasta, and they make flatbreads, and they mix it with flour and make more risen breads. So I envision that 10 years from now we are going to have cooperatives that harvest, that take care of your trees, that take the nuts every fall and put them in drying houses and mill them so that we can have flour available. And then there could even be cooperative bakeries and food carts selling chestnut treats and a return of chestnut roasters on every corner. So they're such a good food. I had chestnut pancakes this morning and they were fantastic. Yeah. So that, to me, that's the vision. By giving away these trees to people who are going to also be giving away nuts, I'm ensuring that our work will lead to more plantings, will lead to a culture of people sharing, will lead to people finding recipes, building sort of the communal life of a culture that chestnuts, the thing is, you can grow them and you can have them, but once you want those chestnuts all year, once you produce more chestnuts, like 2 trees will produce all the grain equivalent nutrition a person needs a year. Now, I want to eat other stuff too, so I'm going to eat potatoes, I'm going to eat wheat, I'm going to eat all the other stuff. But 2 trees could be enough for half of the grain needs of 2 people, or it could be a couple, a tenth of the needs of more people. As we get more chestnuts, right, we feed more people and we grow capacity. We grow all that. So that's the idea, that the chestnuts are a seed and they start more things from that. At the same time, it's also something, it's fun, it's light. A lot of good comes from it, but literally it's just, it's chestnuts, it's a nut. I'm excited when we get 1 million chestnuts planted, the things that we can plant around them or near them. And at some point I'll do a stream talking about agroforestry in general and food forests and the other things that mix with that. So I'm coming to the end of the time that I set aside for this. I want to say thank you to everybody who showed up. We had, I think at peak, we had like 25 people at one time, which was really fun. And now we're down to 12, but thank you for sticking around for this. I feel really good about this space. It was really, I'm grateful that people were here while I just like figured out the tech and got to know how this works. Expect more of these and expect me to be a lot more natural with it as we get going. All right. Everybody have a good night. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming. It meant a lot. I have a really supportive community. One of the things that I'm really grateful for is like I feel like a lot of nonprofits work really hard to create social media, and it ends up coming across as really really fake, just simply because they're struggling. I kind of started with this as the opposite. I feel like I didn't launch this nonprofit. I feel like a lot of Twitter people launched me, and so every day I'm here to serve that community, right? But it means that people then show up. I get nice 20 people showing up randomly to a thing because they can. Anyway, thank you all.